This week on the Futurists, Michael Clark.
I think what AI has done for all of us is woken us up. It's made us realize that there's inadequacies in the system, but also inadequacies in our education, but also how we think about data itself.
Welcome back to the Futurists. I am your host, Brett King, and I am live in Dubai this week, and we are heading to the Museum of the Future today to basically get ready for our massive futurist event, April 19 and 20 next year. It will be the largest gathering of futurists on the planet. And to celebrate that today, I'm sitting with my good pal and friend, well, pal and friend mean the same thing, really, Michael Clark, a data scholar, futurist, previously heading up data for MasterCard in the region, now out on his own doing some amazing things. Michael Clark, welcome to the show.
Long overdue and amazing to be here.
It is. If we look at where Dubai is at today, given, what's happened over the last 10, 15, 20 years today, it's one of very few economies that's really future focused. I've seen the same in Saudi this week, but why have you chosen to base yourself as a data scholar and a futurist in Dubai?
I think it's a great question. I think you've answered it in what you first said. It's one of the few countries in the world that has a long-term vision, probably alongside China, in terms of a sort of a 10-year view. When I wanted to come here, or at least looked at where should I place myself as a futurist, where do you place your bets? Where are the growth areas? And Dubai was an obvious place. All the puzzle pieces were here. A desire and a vision of 10 years to be something, to leverage technology, but at the same time, there was a role for people in all of that. And an open ecosystem. So it just made sense to be here. At the time when I moved, it just had this smell in the air like the next Silicon Valley,
Yeah, what's really interesting is, when I'm in the States or I'm in Europe, there's this collective fear about the future, right? And particularly in the US, you have a large part of the political movement, Make America Great Again, is very rearward looking, right? We can get into the debate of when was America great, but that's quite common in these countries where you see conservative movements coming out now. There's a lot of that, rearward looking backwards. But with the rate of change that we're experiencing, particularly around AI and, of course, climate change and so forth, the need to adapt and be agile as a government from a policy and regulatory perspective has never been more important. What do you think, Dubai was this sort of experiment in the desert, over the last 20 years building this out, but what's been at the heart of that ability to focus on the future?
I think it comes from the ruler in the early days. It was just having that vision to say, actually, we want it to be this. And I think there's also been an adaptability over time. The greatest example was the flooding we had recently in Dubai.
Right.
We had 6 months rain, equivalent to UK 6 months rain in 24 hours.
Yeah.
It was cleared in 48.
Yeah.
But there was a recognition that we didn't have a sewage system.
Yeah.
So then, instead of having months and months in debate over policy, a
let's
fund
get it
was
done.
created, and let's just get it done.
Yeah.
So you have this let's get it done attitude with a vision, but also an awareness and an adaptability, which is very unusual. Like in most countries, there's a time delay when things happen. You have to wait for policy, you have to wait for debate. Where here is, no, it's the right thing, and we believe it should be done, it just gets done.
It has to be done at some point.
Yeah,
we may
100%.
as well do it now.
Why not do it now?
Yeah. Whereas in multi-party systems or two-party system like the States, you have to get bipartisan agreement on this stuff. And I'm not saying autocratic rule is necessarily the way to go, but there is an efficiency when it comes to future agility that it's getting more and more difficult in these politically bifurcated systems where getting bipartisan agreement is increasingly difficult, particularly as we're sort of seeing politics sort of pitch red versus blue, Tories versus, et cetera, et cetera. And it seems to be just making it much harder to be adaptable in the future. But let's talk about the data, your space in the data world, because over the last few years there has been focus on data, particularly coming out of the EU with the General Data Protection Ordinance and regulation around that. But we are seeing an explosion of data. Like it's the Cambrian age of AI based on data. We're seeing this massive focus on this, but how should we be viewing data as we make this transition, to an AI-based, heavily autonomous world?
I think it's a great question. I tend to look at data as potential. I think we've been looking at data as fear in some cases. Rightly so.
Something to be protected.
Something to be protected, something to be maintained private. And the reality is, through history, we've all missed out because decisions were made the way it was commoditized.
Okay, explain that. What have we missed out on?
So we've missed out the ability to connect it. So today, Amazon only knows Amazon's view of your life.
Right.
Apple only knows your Apple life. Through history, because data was never an asset, or it was never considered as that, and part of technology, the technology was always the focus.
So not only have we siloed systems, but we've siloed data.
Correct.
So things like medical data, which should be transportable.
Yes.
Means that, even your identity as you cross into new jurisdictions and so forth.
I would argue what we've done is we've siloed potential. That's what we've done. That's what we've done. If you think of your health, 2024, not a single person alive has a single view of their health.
Yeah.
Which is a crazy thing for me to say. If you think about how big Apple could become, imagine if all of your data was connected. How big could Apple become? Because we trust the brand.
But is that part of the problem that, we have these massive organizations like the Cambridge Analytica thing, with Facebook and so forth is, they've got access to plenty of data, but their view is they're trying to monetize Correct. That data. They're trying to monetize us, and, what you're talking about, like Apple has that potential, but, is data becoming a basic human right, access to your own data? Because we talk about data privacy, but in the AI world, the biggest challenge right now is, all these LLMs and so forth using our data, putting that into these models. And, we don't necessarily, just like Facebook, we don't get direct value from that. So maybe the issue is not privacy at all, but it's, how your data is valued in the system.
Completely. And I would argue it's not really about privacy anymore, it's about ownership and choice.
Right.
So, for example, if we want to get the best from AI, and you and I have talked a lot about this, it's about collaborative intelligence.
Right.
So by that I mean, look, AI is only going to reach its full potential when it's running on my data in real time, using everything it knows about me. So the biggest challenge so far, we've been told in 2026, we're going to run out of all the data to train LLMs, which actually isn't true, because every human alive creates 1.7 meg every second, which is a lot of data by the time you go to bed at night. So the data's there. It's the fact is we're just not giving people access to it, which then leads you to the next question. Well, if we did give people the access, do they even have the skills and abilities to do it, which then challenges education? Because I think what AI has done for all of us is woken us up. It's made us realize that there's inadequacies in the system, but also inadequacies in our education, but also how we think about data itself.
So, we've worked together for a number of years. You worked with us on Movin' back in the day. But when did you realize from a career perspective that you wanted to be a data futurist?
It's it's not something you wake up every day and say, I want to do this.
No. What was the moment you were like, I'm going to become the data guy?
So I think 4 years ago, I wrote a paper in one of my previous jobs. And the ask was, can you write about the data until 2033? And at the time, it was when the metaverse was becoming a big thing. And we wanted to understand, well, what does data mean in virtual worlds? Right? We even called the paper Data in Augmented Worlds. And in writing it, I realized I was unpacking an economy. And it was almost when you have those moments when the air gets sucked out the room and you think, this is much bigger than I realized. But more importantly, there's a story here that needs to be told, in the sense that there's a story of data that none of us have heard and what we've all missed out on. But then there needs to be a guidebook that says, well, how do we make this real? And that just started the journey. And then I was allowed to speak at corporate events, to central banks and C-suite, and it was landing. Like there was this realization that we need to look at data differently. But then it was more a case of, well, that's okay for a business level, but how do I get people in the street to care and get them to understand what is now possible or could be possible? And that's how it all started.
So we talk a lot about methodologies, on this show. You're throwing out some great numbers here in terms of the amount of data we generate each day, and we can talk about the yottabytes and zettabytes of data that we create as a planet and so forth, and then undoubtedly we're going to at some point we'll get into the energy requirements for storing all of this data and so forth. But from a forecasting perspective, it is. Because of the masses of data we're dealing with and trying to figure out what of that data is just junk, versus what of that data is usable. How do you forecast that explosion of data? What sort of methodologies can you use when we're dealing with such big numbers?
So a lot of it we can look at the devices and what they predicted at a device level. One thing that is probably missing, which is what I'm working on now in the book and stuff, which we'll talk about, I'm sure, is the intrinsic and extrinsic value of data. Because I would argue we store data we never use.
Right.
And we don't even need, which is why compute power is so high today, because we're processing data we probably don't even need. Because most businesses don't even understand where the value actually is in their data. The average person in the street certainly doesn't. So a lot of this is about understanding, like for example, the IDC predict we'll do like 187, 175 zettabytes. But that's actually not true. We'll end up doing 74,000. Because their reports don't include IoT devices, they don't include headsets, all of that stuff. If we all live to be 90 years of age, we'll create about 4.5 billion, which is about 65 million football stadiums worth of data, which is an awful lot, right? So we need to start understanding what's the value in our data. So methodologies I use, we look at devices, we track, how much is predicted per device per country and usage. That gives you a guide. But more importantly is, well, do we need what we're keeping, right? Is it useful?
We've got that, and we're losing human knowledge as well, right?
100%.
We're losing, we look at historical data. We know very little about early human society. And even the loss of the Great Library of Alexandria and things like that. Who knows what data's been lost in the past, and we're losing. Even like the early internet, we've lost most of that.
Yeah, 1991 to 95 wasn't really archived. So all that's gone. I think you touched on a really good point, because people don't realize, I think, that data is now our new cultural asset. Because, look, why do people go to see the Egypt pyramids every year? Because they want to learn from stories from the past.
Yeah.
Because data is also a story, a memory, and an experience. If you look at the internet from 2009 to 2018, if you added up, this loss of MySpace, GeoCities, if you add all of that data, it's like me deleting the New York Library off the face of the earth, or half the Vatican archives. So a lot of the work that I'm also doing is transforming data into a real-world asset like water, because then it's regulated as such, but we also appreciate it that way, because we recognize now, we started the conversation talking about monetization of data, but actually data's a utility, it's a store of value, but also it's a record of our past and probably who we're going to be, if you put AI in the mix as well, right?
So as an individual, I feel like I've got a fairly good grasp on my data universe to some extent, but there's now so much data that, me managing this, like we talk about data ownership, and I think you and I are on the same page in that front, but in terms of data ownership, the reality is there's so much data that we generate now as humans, geolocation data, health data, financial data, et cetera, that how can we possibly, even in an ownership scenario, what tools do we need to manage that?
So it's a combination, and we touch this in the book. Unsurprisingly, AI will play a part, right? You and I think we're in agreement that people will have their own wallets, which will manage that storage, and there'll be companies that will manage it for you, like a data trust is a good example. Smart contracts will play a role. I think what people don't realize as well is there's different degrees of ownership. Because the only thing we really own truly is our identity.
Different classes of data too, right?
So we own our own identity, right? That's a form of data, like our name, address, email, all that stuff. But when it comes to relationships with companies and the data we generate, that's probably a license agreement between two parties. Our AI will help us determine what's valuable and what's not. Smart contracts will control periods of ownership under what conditions. And there'll be a role for blockchain, obviously, and all those sorts of technologies. So I think for the first time in 10, 15, maybe 20 years, we can actually now have a conversation about ownership. Because in the past, the technology wasn't there to make this possible. Now we have it, and AI has woken us up. And could we use this now as a catalyst moment, not as a moment of fear? Because then if we use this and say, well, actually, the real asset in all of this is data. Because AI needs us, and we need AI, and the common denominator in between the two of us is data. We need to be able to interpret that data, what AI gives us. We, in turn, need to give AI more data to keep it evolving and learning. Because the knowledge is not from us anymore. The knowledge is coming from AI, because it can view things faster than we can, it can generate patterns. Where we come in is wisdom, essence, and the skills to interpret it to a degree.
Data wisdom. I like that. That's yeah. So, actually, you know Brian Romley, right?
Yeah.
So Brian talks about his wisdom keeper as an AI, and I think it's a really interesting way to think about personal AI as a function. And we're definitely going to need AI to help us work out data.
So I look at similarly. I call the AI as a guardian. So your wallets will have a guardian.
Yeah.
Because I think we won't cure cancer, but we'll prevent it.
Right.
Because our own AI on our device, with our connected healthcare data, the knowledge of the environment around us. So let me give you an example. I've got a friend who's got a health app or capability for the environment. And her daughter was going to go swimming in a lake. And because she had access to the environmental data, she could tell her there was mercury in the lake. So AI is going to tell us things about our environment that we can't see.
Yeah.
Because we have the data, it knows our health condition, it knows all of these aspects of our life, it will protect us, it will inform us, it will educate us. So wisdom, guardian, whatever you want to call it, this is going to be the navigator through life using connected data that's ours in real time. But more importantly, it's shareable, because I think it's the collaboration piece that's going to make all this possible.
So the way you're talking about data as an asset and as infrastructure and and so forth, it sounds almost like you're describing the financial system. So where does that cross over? Data from in terms of monetizing an individual's data, your own data, because if we're talking about data ownership and leverage of that data versus protecting the data, if we let go of the protection element and talk more about what is the value of your personal data, then it seems like it much more closely is valued like the financial system.
It is. In the book, I called it an intelligence economy, because almost you're trading intelligence through collaboration. It's an amazing asset because it's a store of value and a utility at exactly the same time. So like in an economy, it has financial value, because it'll be financially valuable to me or valuable to someone else who wants that intelligence. But it's also a little bit different from a financial system, because you have an asset that's value is probably infinite, because it gets built on over time, which is something we've never done, by the way, because we recycle a lot of the same data. So it has very similarities to an economic system, particularly how things are shared and valued and priced, but it has different use cases.
Can you give me an example of data that we reuse?
So health is a great example. Like, I build on my health data every morning, but then there's things I recycle from my health data. For example, the Pebble watch came out. It disappeared and all that health data vanished. And now I have to start again. If you wear an Apple Watch, a Garmin watch, and suddenly everybody wears Whoops today, suddenly Whoop goes bust in 4 years' time, what happens to all my data?
To the data?
So we recycle a lot. Like, we're building on data constantly if we keep a device. So my Whoop, I'm building on that data every day. Like, what I start off at 9 o'clock is not what happens at 5 o'clock at night. It's like your identity. You build up your identity through every interaction, like a credit score. And you're doing that with data constantly.
But then data has been commercialized, and because we tie data storage, at least, to a corporation that isn't immutable, right? It could fail. Then, Does it mean we have to have a different type of data infrastructure at an economy level to ensure that data is protected? But then, like hashtag capitalism, we're not going to have the corporate ownership of that data if it's extensible, right?
Yeah. It's a tricky balance. Like I work with a lot of companies like Holon who do decentralized storage and other people like that, who are building in those trusted ecosystems through the technology. I think you really raise a good point about the infrastructure, because I'd argue today like cloud computing is almost a bit like unregulated banking. And by that I mean, look, we go into a bank today, I deposit $10,000. Depending on the country, I'm insured for that money on deposit. And the bank has some rules around what they can do with it, and I can get it back as long as I got the right identity. However, when it comes to my photographs, I don't have those same deposit controls and protections and insurance. And when it comes to using that data, if I don't consent to it being used, that metadata can be used for other things. So
Perfect.
I will then end up in a place where I'll ask you a question, what's more important to you? If the bank lost that money or your cloud provider lost 20 years of your photographs on your memories? And that's what it comes down to. We're now in a position where data is as close to everyday life as importance as water. And it's reached
That's
that
a
same
big
status.
statement. That's a big statement, man. Data is as important as water. It's certainly probably as common as water.
But you couldn't, if Google suddenly turned off tomorrow, we saw with the outage with the recent Windows trouble, nobody could get home. All the data that we all relied on was gone. And it was nothing to do really with the software. It's the fact that the thing we relied on was gone.
This is an argument I hear often about this is why we need primitive systems like paper and paper money and things like that. But I think it's just like, well, no. I mean, there was a time we didn't have electricity. And you wouldn't say you need to keep gas lamps around just in case the electricity system fails.
Correct.
You transition to a point where you just have to rely on that infrastructure over time, right? So,
but also, are they critical service providers? So if data becomes an asset, would those companies then be treated like a water company?
Data that's too big to fail.
Correct.
Yeah. Which could be good or bad. All right, so this is, at this point, before we go to break, Michael, we like to have what we call the lightning round and ask you a few punchy questions to get a little bit more insight about you. So, welcome to the lightning round. What was the first science fiction or futurist type concept you remember being exposed to on TV or in books?
I used to watch, this is back in the day, show my age now, I used to watch Tomorrow's World.
Oh.
In the UK as a kid.
They had teleporting, right?
Yeah.
I remember that show.
So they used to, every week they used to show you something new from the future or could be for 10 years.
Yeah.
And that was my go-to.
Yeah.
So Tomorrow's World was like the thing in my house.
Okay.
That just always kind of, and then my father brought me home the world's first computer, like a ZX80 Spectrum. So I was kind of always watching this on TV, and it kind of gave me an inspiration to say, what comes next?
Oh, that your dad was insightful enough to think you should get into computers at a young age.
Yeah.
I started coding on a Commodore VIC-20, but anyway.
Yeah.
We'll go. All right, so what technology do you think has most changed humanity?
It's interesting, because for research for the book, there was different phases of it. You could argue like the Rosetta Stone for language was huge. I think we can't underestimate what the internet did. So I'd probably say the internet, because it connected, I won't say the internet, for two reasons. One, in 1991, it was amazing, because it gave us almost what it should be. And then in 2003, it gave it to what it is today. So I think an amazing invention which changed the course of data, good and bad.
Cool. It's interesting, everything you seem to put through a data lens, which I like. All right, name a futurist or an entrepreneur that's influenced you, and why?
I can name two people. So one is you.
Oh, thank you.
So I think, unknown to me, you've kind of mentored me a little bit through the journey. I think that's cool in terms of a giving back. But I also think you're always changing as well.
Yeah.
So that adaptability
This show is proof of that, I think.
Yeah. And also your journey you're on, right? From the banking
absolutely.
to the broader futurism, I think is great. I think another one that's really interesting me at the moment is Elon as well.
Yeah.
So I think if you cut through
If you get rid of the politics, he's still a brilliant guy.
like where he's going, and like with the satellite infrastructure or capability, and the fact that people forget Tesla is probably the biggest data company in the world.
Yeah.
What he's doing and where he wants to go, I think all roads eventually lead you to him.
Yeah, I think something like now that in terms of satellite infrastructure, that SpaceX/Starlink has. It's something like 60% of satellite infrastructure on the planet is owned by them. I mean, their launch cadence, 2 or 3 launches a week anyway. All right, last question. What science fiction or future story is most representative of the future that you hope for?
Oh, that's a really good question.
Like, is there a story that projects data in a way that you think is that we should aspire to?
I don't know, because part of my hope for all of this is that we give everybody in the world the right to create and own and use and realize their potential through data. And there's not many books that talk to that, I don't think. No. Because what I'm saying is that...
Maybe you should write one.
Exactly. I believe there's someone on this earth who has data that we've never seen because they've never been given the right to create it. And who knows what we could do with it if we shared it and collaborated. So there's many sci-fi books. Ministry of the Future is a good one. We had Kim Stanley Robinson on. Phenomenal guy. Which is close to the mark. If you think about where the world is going. He's actually trying to create this right now, you know. Certainly, if you haven't listened to that episode, go back and check out the 2-part special we did with Kim Stanley Robinson, because he is definitely one of the greatest living sci-fi authors on the planet right now, especially from a climate adaptability perspective. I agree. All right, let's take a quick break. You're listening to The Futurists. I'm with Michael Clark. We'll be right back after this break. Provoke Media is proud to sponsor, produce, and support the Futurist podcast. Provoke.fm is a global podcast network and content creation company with the world's leading fintech podcast and radio show, Breaking Banks. And of course, its spin-off podcast, Breaking Banks Europe, Breaking Banks Asia Pacific. But we also produce the official Finovate podcast, Tech on Reg, and Emerge Everywhere, the podcast of the Financial Health Network. For information about all our podcasts, go to provoke.fm or check out Breaking Banks, the world's #1 fintech podcast and radio show. Welcome back to The Futurists. I am Brett King. We are in Dubai and recording this segment live from the Museum of the Future and with Michael Clark. Michael, you mentioned earlier in the first segment that you're working on a book. I know the book is coming out soon. Tell us a little bit about the book and what you're espousing. Yeah, so the book has gone through about 1 million different titles until I really landed on it. The book is called Data Revolution, Unlocking Human Potential, with a subtitle of The Journey That You've Never Walked. And what I wanted to do was, it's almost like a book in a book. So the first part of the book is really about the story of data that you've probably never heard. So, and you and I talked about it the other evening, is like the research is the fun bit. So it's taking the reader back to almost cave paintings and taking them through to present day.
Interesting. So you think of cave paintings data?
Yes. So I think there was a magic trident that we lost through history, which was data, identity, and value. That connection got broken through technology.
So describe how they were connected in more primitive times.
So if you look at a cave painting, a picture of a family is identity. It's a form of data. It has a value.
Right.
So in that moment, there was a record of the past and also a representation of those identities and those people.
Because up until that time before, it had been mainly verbal history.
Correct.
But now we had a hard representation of that, something that was more tangible.
Correct. And then that transitioned then to Rosetta Stone, so data then became a form of language. So it allowed us then to speak and communicate. And as time progressed, we ended up in the industrial age, and then our view of data became, economic output was driven by machines at that point. And for necessity, if you think about the world rebuilding after World War II. But then once we hit 1960, 1970, what happened? Identity became a password for mainframe computing. Our data became more of a number. And effectively, a world became driven by productivity and efficiency, which we know hasn't really changed. So that's a story not of, hey, data's bad and big tech's awful. It's really a story of the potential we all missed out on because our data was never connected. It was never owned. It was never an asset. So in essence, we all lost out of, our health that was never connected, all of those things we've talked about.
So we've worked very hard to connect the financial system.
Yeah.
So that financial transactions, and we use monetary value at the core of what we're doing. But data is, well, theoretical. I mean, money is data, right?
Whether we like it or not, everything we see every day is data. A painting is data, it's just in a different form. And as you go through history, you see these changes. Like the internet became commodities of everything. And the data just got lost and further behind the tech.
So let's look at 20 or 30 years then. How does this change?
If we change the direction of travel and we say, right, data is an asset, in 10, 20 years, we could see a child born into the world of data, which means what? They can critically think, they can debate, they can reason, and use their own AI with their own data, with the right literacy skills, to then solve incredible problems.
So, you talk about data as an asset and data infrastructure and so forth, but not all data is created equal. So how are we going to get the tools to ensure that the right data is kept and the data that is superfluous, junk data, we don't, how do you determine that?
So it's a great question. So the book, I didn't want it to just be a book of theory. So the second part of the book is how to actually do all of this. So it's the human dimension in it, it's the role of AI, but more importantly then, what makes data an asset and how do you use it? So what is it, why it's an asset, who owns the asset, which is more than just people today. And then more importantly, which leads on to your question, is how do you value the asset? Which means I had to revisit historical forms of value. So intrinsic value, things like reputation, cultural value, all these things, uniqueness, all those things that got lost because of the industrial age and capitalism. And then an extrinsic value. If you apply those value systems then to data that you receive with an AI that's comparing the data that you have versus what you received based on the value to either the outside world or to you, it will decide whether you keep it or not.
So intrinsic value I get, because this is data that's valuable to you, your children's DNA, your bank account, your IP that you've created. But what do you mean by extrinsic data?
So it's the same data, but what's it valued to the outside world? So your AI and various other mechanisms I talk in the book is going to help you determine what that external value is. Because it's an amazing asset, because it's everything and nothing at exactly the same time. I could, for example, be in one environment with the same data. So let's give an example. I could be measuring climate in Dubai in the winter, and that could be really valuable to a climate. But the same data for a tourist company in that period of time, say it's the summer, so both are looking at the summer, worthless, because less people come to Dubai in the summer months because it's too hot. So you've got the same data worth more in one setting than another. So it's everything and nothing at exactly the same time.
So we're talking a lot about, Rob, who wasn't able to join us today because we're not in the same location, but Rob talks a lot about the digital twin model. And there's big efforts, particularly in, places like Dubai, the UAE and in Saudi and so forth, to create, these early digital twin models. And that, in theory, is trying to be a data representation of the real world, the world in real time. So looking out over 20 to 30 years, are we going to have a data representation of the way the world works? Is that how you envisage it?
I'd go even further, say you'll have a version of you. So take today, because we don't own our data, we also can't inherit that data. I can't hand it down to my children because that's a record of my life. Over the last, you and I, I'm big into longevity. We track our health and we learn things and we have specific biomarkers and we lose all of that. But if I own it, I could now hand that down to my grandchildren or whatever. And who knows, in 20 years' time, they're A/B testing their health with their own digital twin, a digital twin of them.
Yeah.
That's completely likely. And that's really, if you take this to the nth degree, if you own your data, it's connected, you can read it, you can understand it, it's portable. All of these technologies are going to allow us to do some truly amazing things. And the scary thing is the tech's there.
Yeah.
Like, the EU is already building Destination Earth, a digital twin of planet Earth. Can you imagine what they could do with all the other data that they can't see today, giving them a true picture? Combine that in 5 years' time with off-planet data, and 6G in 5 years' time, who knows what we could do.
So having worked with you on your book more recently, one of the things I find very interesting, which sort of flies in the face of modern economics, is you say that data is actually more valuable to us than money. So explain why you feel that about data. I mean, obviously you're a data practitioner, so I get it. But let's take the hyperbole out of it.
Yeah. So I guess I was a data guy, but I also worked in banking as well. So I worked for JP Morgan and others for many years. So you and I know how money is distributed, and the purpose of money, where data is limitless. It's infinite in its nature. We reprint money and it causes all sorts of problems in the economy, and it's typically controlled by circulation by central bodies, where data is limitless. Its control is in real time. It's real. It's not something that I'm hedging against, or it's a number on a screen. This is real. I can touch it, I can see it, it's there. But it's a multiplier. So it has tons more value because the more I have of it, it's like money, but then it flips because it's also utility. It's so much like water than money, but it's more powerful than money.
But you say data's real, but we've got a lot of issues right now of we don't know whether stuff is real, right? Fake news and we have manufactured video and so forth, and of course AI is going to make that even more possible potential. So what is the regulatory infrastructure required to ensure that data is real?
So this is where ownership is really a good thing, because now the regulator can refocus their attention somewhere else. So if you think about it, we've been fighting the privacy battle for decades. And I would argue with AI now, it's almost an impossible battle. Because one, it's moving too quickly, and we can't fool ourselves to think that no AI is not going to fool the regulator, right? So if the regulator no longer has to focus on privacy because we have the technology to do that, they can now focus on other things like ethics, security, all the things that really matter now. And more importantly, we have an educational system that educates people on what to look for, how to be data literate, how to think critically, and know the difference between what's real and what's not, with a regulatory system that backs that up, that's adaptable, and has the right people in those departments that actually help them and guide them as well.
I mean, this is one of the issues I have with people talking about financial literacy, right? Is, when I hear the banking industry talk about financial literacy, that's mostly exclusionary, right? If you don't have the right education, you're not in the club, and you can't get access to the best asset classes and returns. Like that's literally how the banking. We even put financial advisors in the way of using the system, right? Is that the risk, the way that data goes as well?
I don't think so. So one thing that's interesting with data is data and AI doesn't care how old you are. So that's the first thing. Because actually, the older you are, the richer your data will become in this economy. Because if you imagine giving your data to an AI and you're 50, 60, 70 years old and you've got your faculties, because people are living longer as well, that's a richer piece, right? And the financial system, one thing we can learn from the financial system, and we're starting to repeat it in the data world, which is one thing I'm trying to change, is we're now, because of AI, we're all making sure that everybody in the business world is data literate. And we're forgetting the end consumer, who is completely illiterate, or at least not as literate as they should be. So, for example, 16% of people in the UK can't find their balance on a bank statement. So we are now heavily skewed again to making sure that our businesses are optimal and everybody can use the AI. But what we should be doing is making sure that our customers are data literate. I think the good thing with AI, though, if we get the data right, it will adjust what the user sees based on their educational level. So
we have to solve problems like hallucinations and stuff with the AIs for that, right?
Yeah, which is, again, if it becomes an asset, if we use it on real-time data, the big part of hallucination is it doesn't have enough parameters. Like, we're building models that are way too big. Like, I think you and I have talked in the past about agents. We'll get to a place where AI will be modular.
Right.
And I'll have AI for my health. I'll have AI for my finance. Google proved it in 2022 that smaller models are more efficient.
Yeah.
What you need to do is, once you have a smaller model, you can give it much more data. So its accuracy level increases. That becomes so important that when I'm running it on my own device, because now that's real time. That's me in the moment, because who I was 5 minutes ago is not who I am right now. And that's why it needs to be real time. And those hallucinations will drop over time with the models becoming smaller.
So looking at, and we can come back to the book on this, but, who are the early proto, organizations or institutions that you think understand this transition that's going to happen with data in the world?
I think all roads, again, lead to China in a way. So China 2 years ago launched Element X, which kind of went under the radar. It was almost their commitment to say, right, we've done digital. We recognize now data is actually the key to our use of AI.
So for those who aren't familiar, can you explain
Element?
Element X?
Element X is, I kind of discovered it when I was doing my research, is an initiative that China adopted to bring the focus solely on data, with a 26% GDP aspiration of growth using data. Wow. It was almost like a recognition to say, we've done our digital journey. Now we recognize for us to fully harness the power of AI, we need to focus more on the data. Another example would be Brazil. Andre, a good friend of ours,
Yep.
That's a market that's hopefully soon are going to allow its citizens to monetize their own data. If we think about the PIX network, it's totally set up for tokenized data and moving things digitally around. And then we come here in Dubai. There's a big event this week talking about the next economy. I've personally been involved in writing a regulatory paper to make data a digital asset here for the first time in the world. So it's moving, it's happening. Interestingly, we're seeing more growth in the startup community, now heavily focused on data ownership, data asset, data empowerment. These are naturally coming as a byproduct of AI, where they're now looking at, like me and probably like you, AI is not something we fear, AI is our collaborative partner through this journey.
You've used this word a few times. You've talked about collaborative intelligence and, collaboration. I feel quite strongly about this myself. The magnitude, the order of magnitude of problems that we're going to face, with technology, unemployment, AI displacement, climate change and so forth. These are problems that at scale now are too large for the existing economic systems to resolve, right? And, if you're listening to this and you disagree, then I would just say, well, climate change is evidence of that, right? Because if we knew how to fix climate change in the current capitalist environment, we would have. Instead, it's created that problem. So collaboration seems to me to be an absolutely essential part of the future of society. So how does data fit into a drive towards collaborative approach rather than sort of a competitive approach?
So I totally agree with you, by the way. And the collaborative piece is we need to build on data and we need to share it to learn from it. Through the sharing of it, we create more data for AI.
Geographical boundaries for data doesn't make any sense, right?
No, it doesn't. Because what do we do with less developed nations who we feel are less developed but actually know more than we do? Because they've just learned other new abilities. They've taken the same ability and applied it in a different way. And we assume they're not as good as us. But actually we have the data they need.
Let's look at, we are learning so much now about psychoactive compounds, for example, and the benefits to health, PTSD, depression, autism, ADHD, etc. And we in the West, we tried to ban that, the war on drugs. And now it seems like we're going back to these 1,000-year-old views of these things. And we lost that data. We lost that knowledge.
I'll give you an example of collaboration. So I think I told you this story yesterday. It's really powerful. So I met a lady on a plane who broke her back through having back cancer.
Oh, wow.
And she basically said, look, she was given stage 4. A year later, she was cured because she chose her own way, but combined it with what the doctor said. So an element of collaboration. But then she's in a position now where everybody wants to know what she did. She's a life coach and so on. But I said to her, look, if you owned your data, you could have kept a track of what you had. You could have shared that data with other people instead of talking them through it. They could have run an AI on top of that, found the things that's relevant for them, and maybe together you share it with a drug company. Instead of a cure, they deliver an algorithm to everyone. So the only way we are going to prevent disease or we're going to learn from each other is, this is why I call it collaborative intelligence. It's the combination of what a person brings and a machine brings, and sharing that in an ecosystem through license agreements, through shared value, whatever it is going to allow us to evolve and adapt. And that's why by doing this now, we also face into the borders problems and everything else and think of this as a different asset in its own right and an opportunity to grow our collective intelligence.
Well, if you're really going to value each individual, from a perspective of where they fit in the world, you have to go outside of the sort of jurisdictional views, because, particularly if we do have 1 billion eco-refugees, for example, you don't want people who are displaced by climate to lose their identity.
Correct. And that's a big challenge, right? Because even people who live in other countries for a period of time and then go back to their home and they haven't got an identity again.
Yeah.
Part of the identity problem, which I'm trying to solve in the book, is we've also separated identity from data, which is why identity is so valuable in the dark web. Because if you connect identity with data, all of a sudden all your doors are open.
But if you had an intrinsic identity data framework globally, right, then you could reinforce that.
Correct.
All right. So at this point of the show, we like to get a bit sci-fi, right?
Correct.
You'll know. So we like to look out 20, 30 years. So let's talk about the world in 2050. What role will data play in that world of the future?
Look, I think if you follow this to its trajectory, at the moment the data we know about is more about our bodies. We know very little about the mind. I think once we connect the data and we start to give people the literacy skills, AI evolves in the direction of collaborative intelligence rather than taking over the world, as most people believe. Eventually we'll connect the data with our mind and our body. So by 2050, we should be in the era of knowing, where we know ourselves, we know what's true and we know what's not. And maybe the word data doesn't exist anymore.
Right.
Because we just know.
Right.
So now you're in a different era altogether of cognitive intelligence. So I think if you take it to its nth degree, and everybody has access to the data that's theirs, they have the literacy skills that they need, we bring quantum computing into the mix. So in the book, I've showed the model of how this economy could work, as well as all the new regulation, the value systems and everything.
Probabilistic data.
Yes.
Yeah.
So can you imagine if you're now running that on a quantum-based infrastructure, running on your own device, with your own AI, with your own data portfolios, what could you now do? Through next generation scenario planning, different perspectives and projections of your life. That would be amazing in 2050. And think about not what we cure, what we prevent and what we learn from each other in collective intelligence and collaborative intelligence. That could be game changing.
And, do you think that governments will sort of socialize data in that respect, or is it still going to be, driven by the corporate elements as it is today?
So I think what's happening of late is that governments are becoming more receptive, because I think they've got no choice, because I think AI is on their doorstep and has woken a lot of us up. And I say that in a very positive way, because it's actually identified flaws, like flaws in the way that we treat ethics, flaws in the way in our educational system, and just the general industrial model that just doesn't work anymore. And AI has woken that up in a good way. And I think when you speak to a government in a very different way and say, look, if we treat this as an asset, it actually has a good benefit to the economy. Because now, as we said in some parts of this conversation, is that data becomes a cultural artifact, but also people who now use it become critical infrastructure. So for governments, actually, it creates more of a partnership with technology companies rather than centralization and, ownership of large parts of data, which we don't really need anymore. So governments are open to it. I think in the future, we'll end up with more innovation and more choice. And I think governments eventually will go back to what we want them to be, which is protecting citizens and using data to do that in a way.
And economies will be focused on providing for citizens.
Correct.
First and foremost, rather than the market.
Exactly.
Yeah. All right. Well, we're running out of time, so let's wrap. But how can people find out more about the book, and see how do they keep following you as a data scholar?
I think all roads lead you to LinkedIn, usually causing havoc and trying to change people's perspectives on data. The website's coming, so keep an eye out on LinkedIn.
Okay.
That will also have pre-orders and things for the books, planned for 2025. But as always, I'm
so
also
Michael Clark, Data Scholar.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Very good. Well, Michael, it's been great to spend some time with you, hanging out in Dubai. Thank you for your support on that. We're really looking forward to the book. And yeah, it's a new world, and data's at the heart of it.
Absolutely.
All right. That's it for the Futurists this week. If you like the show, you know what to do. Leave us a 5-star review. Post post on social about the episode. Share it with your friends, and of course that's what helps us grow the audience. Don't forget. As we are here in Dubai, April 19 and 20, keep the dates free for next year. We are going to have the largest gathering of futurists on the planet at the Dubai Museum of the Future next year. So 2025, keep that focused. And until then, we'll see you in the future.
Well, that's it for the Futurists this week. If you like the show, we sure hope you did. Please subscribe and share it with the people in your community. And don't forget to leave us a 5-star review. That really helps other people find the show. And you can ping us anytime on Instagram and Twitter at Futurist Podcast for the folks that you'd like to see on the show or the questions that you'd like us to ask. Thanks for joining. And as always, we'll see you in the future.